Victor Brennan's Pandora's box opened in a mahogany and glass office in the heart of Seattle when a leather folder slid across the conference table and stopped in front of him. 10 years of arrogance, infidelities, and disdain were about to crumble in a matter of minutes. Claire remained seated on the other side of the table with a posture Victor had never seen before. She wasn't the submissive woman who accepted his flimsy excuses when he came home late smelling of someone else's perfume. She wasn't the compliant wife who smiled at parties while he openly flirted with other women. This Claire had straight shoulders, a steady gaze, and a smile that bordered on satisfaction. Beside her, Kenneth Morrison, a divorce attorney known for dismantling men's fortunes in legal battles, flipped through documents with the calm assurance of someone who already knew the outcome of the game before it even began. Victor felt a chill run down his spine, but he shook off the feeling. He was Victor Brennan, the tech magnate who had transformed a startup into a multi-million-dollar company. He had the best lawyers, the best connections, and most importantly, all the money. Or so he thought. His own attorney, Mitchell Hartley, a 60-year-old man with an impeccable reputation, opened the folder with fingers that trembled almost imperceptibly. Victor noticed the change in his expression, the way his complexion turned slightly pale, as if he were reading his own death certificate. The room on the 32nd floor of the commercial building offered a panoramic view of Puget Sound. Boats glided across the grayish-blue water, oblivious to the personal earthquake about to engulf Victor. It was a Tuesday in October, with that characteristic Seattle autumn chill that seeped into your bones. But the real ice was in that room. Emanating from the documents spread across the table, Morrison began to speak in a professional, almost monotone voice, but each word fell like a sledgehammer on Victor's world. Mr. Brennan, for the past 10 years, you believed yourself to be the owner and CEO of Brennan Technologies. It's understandable, considering your name is on the door, on the business cards, and in all public documents. He paused, a calculated move. However, the true owner of the company, through a complex offshore structure involving the Cayman Islands, Luxembourg, and a Delaware holding company, is my client, Claire Brennan. Victor let out a laugh that was meant to sound confident, but it came out strange, almost hysterical. This is ridiculous. I founded this company. I worked day and night. I made every deal, closed every contract. Claire finally spoke, and her voice held a coldness Victor had never noticed before. Or perhaps it had always been there, and he simply never bothered to listen. You worked with my family's money, Victor, from day one. Morrison continued, pulling document after document from the folder like a sinister magician conjuring rabbits from a hat. Each paper was a revelation, another layer of the lie that had been Victor's life. Brennan Technologies had initially been registered by Claire through a shell company called Cascadia Holdings. All the initial capital, which Victor believed had come from angel investors impressed by his vision, was actually money from a trust fund established by Claire's grandfather, an oil magnate who amassed a fortune in Texas before dying and leaving millions to his granddaughter. The investors were real, Morrison explained, but the money they invested was in fact capital my client injected through offshore channels. The contracts were structured to make it seem like legitimate external investments. Hartley, Victor's lawyer, finally found his voice. This is fraud. My client has been deceived for years. We can contest all of this. Morrison smiled, and it was not a kind smile. Fraud. All documents were signed voluntarily by your client. He never bothered to read what he was signing. Every paper, every contract, every agreement was perfectly legal. Mr. Brennan simply assumed he was in control because he wanted to believe it. Victor felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. Memories began to reconfigure in his mind. Claire was always there at the early meetings, but he had dismissed her contributions, attributing her presence to a superficial interest in his work. She suggested strategies that he adopted as his own. She knew investors he believed he had won over with his charm and intelligence. The Mercedes, Victor murmured, almost to himself, thinking of the car he drove. The house on Mercer Island. Property of Cascadia Holdings, Morrison confirmed. As is the apartment in Manhattan that you use on your business trips, the yacht in the harbor, and the watch collection you so appreciate. Everything legally belongs to my client. Claire leaned slightly forward, and her eyes met Victor's for the first time since the meeting had begun. There was something in that gaze he couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't just anger or revenge. It was something deeper, more painful. It was disappointment. "Did you really think I didn't know, Victor?" Her voice was calm, yet laden with suppressed emotion. "All the times you came home late. All the nights you spent with Jessica from accounting, or with Amanda from the San Francisco conference, or with that model you thought I didn't know about. You treated me as if I were invisible, as if I were just an accessory in your successful life." Victor tried to speak, but the words died in his throat. "I could have left you years ago," Claire continued. "But I wanted you to feel what I felt. The humiliation. The feeling that everything you thought was true was a lie. You lived a fantasy, Victor. A fantasy I carefully built and maintained, waiting for the right moment." Morrison spoke again, this time with a more direct tone. "My client is offering a settlement. The divorce will be finalized with minimal public exposure. Mr. Brennan will receive an amount to re-establish himself, enough to live modestly. In exchange, there will be no legal battle, no media scandal about how the great Victor Brennan was, in fact, supported by his wife throughout his entire career." Hartley looked at Victor with an expression that blended pity and professional discomfort. "Victor, I need to speak with you privately." But Victor didn't move. He was trapped in that chair, in that room, in that moment when his entire identity was disintegrating. The billionaire businessman, the technology visionary, the man who believed he had conquered the world with his own intelligence and determination, discovered that he was merely a puppet in an elaborate theater. Claire stood up, smoothing the gray dress she was wearing. It was elegant, expensive, likely bought with the money Victor thought was his. She walked to the window, observing the city sprawling below them. 10 years, Victor. 10 years I waited for this moment, not for revenge, but for justice. So you would finally understand that I was never the weak, dependent woman you imagined. I was the force behind everything, and you were too blind to see. Victor finally found his voice, but it came out broken, unrecognizable. Why? Why do this? If you had so much power, so much control, why not just leave me? Claire turned, and for the first time since everything began, Victor saw tears in her eyes. But they didn't fall. Because I loved you, and I wanted you to love me back. But you only loved yourself. The silence that followed Claire's words was thick, almost palpable. Victor remained motionless, looking at his own hands as if he didn't recognize them. They were the same hands that had signed millionaire contracts, shaken those of powerful investors, held champagne flutes at celebrations that now seemed pathetic. But these hands had never truly held anything. Everything had been a carefully orchestrated illusion. Morrison broke the silence with professional efficiency, continuing to extract documents from the folder as if unearthing a corpse layer by layer. There are a few more matters that need to be addressed, Mr. Brennan. For the past 10 years, your personal bank account received regular deposits that you believed to be your CEO salary. In reality, these deposits came from an account controlled by my client, structured to appear as legitimate corporate payments. Victor finally looked up, and there was something wild in his eyes now, a mix of panic and disbelief. My salary? You're saying even my salary was hers? Technically, you never had a salary, Morrison replied with factual cruelty. Brennan Technologies, being owned by Cascadia Holdings, paid my client. She, in turn, transferred amounts to your personal account. The tax documents clearly show this, though in a way that a casual observer would never notice the true structure. Hartley, who had remained silent after his failed attempt at defense, finally spoke again, but his voice had lost all its previous confidence. Claire, this will destroy him. Completely. Do you understand what you're doing? It was the first time anyone in the room had addressed her by her first name, without formalities, and the shift in tone revealed something deeper. Victor then realized that Hartley wasn't just defending a client. There was genuine concern there, perhaps even pity. Claire sat back down, crossing her legs with an elegance Victor had stopped noticing years ago. When was the last time he truly looked at her? When was the last time he noticed how her eyes changed color depending on the light? Or how she had a small mole on her left temple that disappeared when she genuinely smiled? "Mitchell," she said, and the use of Victor's lawyer's first name did not go unnoticed. "I'm not doing this to destroy him. I'm doing this because he needs to understand that actions have consequences." Victor felt something burning in his chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time. It was humiliation, pure and searing. But there was also a trace of something more, something he didn't want to name. It was the feeling of loss, not of money or status, but of something far more fundamental. Morrison continued his methodical presentation, each document more devastating than the last. The trip to Dubai last year, which Victor had presented to colleagues as an important contract win, funded by Claire. The investment in the crypto startup that Victor boasted of making with his market intuition. Claire's money, channeled through offshore accounts. Even the Rolex Daytona he wore on his wrist, the one he had told friends he bought to celebrate a particularly profitable quarter, was a gift from Claire, purchased from an account in her name. "There's also the matter of the Tribeca apartment," Morrison continued, and something in his voice subtly shifted. "You've maintained that address for 3 years, correct?" Victor's stomach dropped. The apartment in New York. Jessica. Of course, Claire knew about Jessica. "My client was aware that you used that property, which is registered in the name of Cascadia Holdings, for extramarital encounters. We have complete documentation, entry and exit records from the building, room service receipts, even some interesting photographs from the lobby." For the first time, Claire showed emotion beyond cold determination. Her fingers lightly gripped the arm of the chair, her knuckles turning white for a moment before she forced her hands to relax. "Jessica Thornton," she said, and the name left her mouth like something bitter. 28 years old, Stanford graduate, hired by the Business Development Department 4 years ago. "You were so obvious, Victor. So incredibly obvious. The coinciding trips, the glances during meetings, the way you always defended her, even when she clearly made mistakes." Victor wanted to argue, deny, do anything to deflect that accusing gaze. But denial was impossible. Not when she had proof, not when she had clearly known all this time. "And before her there was Amanda," Claire continued, her voice taking on an almost hypnotic quality, as if she were reciting a grocery list. "Amanda Chen, a marketing consultant we met at the TechCrunch conference in San Francisco 6 years ago. How long did that last, Victor? 8 months? Until she found out about your wife and decided she had higher standards?" Hartley shifted uncomfortably in his chair. This was now going beyond the professional, entering personal territory in a way that made everyone in the room witnesses to something intimate and painful. "Claire," Victor finally managed to say, and his voice came out hoarse, unrecognizable. "I didn't know you knew. I never meant to hurt you like this." She let out a laugh, but there was no humor in it. It was an empty, hollow sound, like something broken trying to work. "You didn't mean to hurt me? Or did you simply not care enough to think whether you would hurt me or not?" She leaned forward, and now Victor could clearly see the tears she had suppressed earlier. "There's a huge difference between those two things, Victor. One implies consideration, the other implies indifference. And guess which was worse?" Morrison placed another document on the table, and this one was different from the others. It was thicker, with several colored tabs marking specific pages. "This is the final divorce settlement," he announced. "As I mentioned earlier, my client is being generous, considering the circumstances. Mr. Brennan will receive a lump sum of $500,000, enough to reestablish himself. Perhaps start something new, as long as it's truly his this time. $500,000. An amount Victor an hour ago would have considered insignificant, pocket change. Now, it was all he would have. All that would remain of a decade of arrogance. Brennan Technologies will remain under my client's control, Morrison continued. You will be removed as CEO, effective immediately. A public statement will be issued citing strategic differences and your desire to pursue other opportunities. There will be no mention of the company's true ownership structure, no public scandal about your actual financial situation. Victor looked at Claire, truly looked at her, perhaps for the first time in years. She had aged, of course, but in a way that only intensified her beauty. There were lines around her eyes he didn't remember seeing before. Expression lines that told stories of smiles and worries he had never witnessed because he was too busy living his life of lies. "Why are you giving me anything?" he asked, genuinely confused. "You could leave me with nothing. You could completely destroy my reputation, expose everything publicly. Why the generosity?" Claire was silent for a long moment, looking out the window at the city sprawling beneath the gray October sky. A ferry crossed Puget Sound, small and distant, moving slowly through the dark water. "Because despite everything, Victor, I still remember who you were when we first met. Or at least, who I thought you were. That man had dreams, passions, a certain vulnerability that disappeared when success, or what you thought was success, went to your head." She turned her gaze back to him, and there was a deep sadness there that made something within Victor contract painfully. "I'm giving you a chance to find that man again. If he still exists somewhere beneath all that arrogance and selfishness." Morrison began to explain the final terms of the agreement. Victor would have 2 weeks to vacate the house on Mercer Island. The Mercedes would be returned. Corporate credit cards would be canceled. He could keep his personal belongings, clothes, some items of sentimental value if there were any. The watch collection, however, would remain, as it technically belonged to Cascadia Holdings. Hartley gently touched Victor's arm. "You need to sign, Victor. There's no better alternative. If this goes to trial, everything will be exposed. Every betrayal, every lie, every penny you thought was yours but was hers. The media will love this story. The great Victor Brennan, revealed as a fraud, a man kept by the wife he repeatedly betrayed." Victor picked up the pen Morrison had strategically placed next to the document. It was a Mont Blanc, expensive and heavy in his hand. Probably also bought with Claire's money, he thought bitterly. Everything in his life had been bought with her money. He signed. His signature, so practiced and confident on so many contracts over the years, came out shaky and uncertain. It was the signature of a defeated man, of a man who had just discovered that his entire life had been an elaborate lie. Claire watched in silence as Morrison gathered the signed documents, carefully placing them back in the leather folder. It was done. 10 years of marriage, 10 years of illusion, ending on a gray Seattle afternoon with signatures on letterhead and the distant sound of traffic below. When Victor finally stood up to leave, his legs were unsteady, as if he were learning to walk again. At the door, he paused and turned one last time. "Claire," he began, but found he had no words. "What do you say to the woman you loved, betrayed, scorned, and who revealed herself to have been your savior all this time?" Apologies seemed insignificant. Gratitude seemed absurd. Anger would be hypocritical. She didn't respond. She simply turned her face toward the window again, dismissing him with that silent gesture. And so, Victor Brennan left the conference room, left the building, left the life he thought he had built, carrying nothing but the devastating truth that he had been a fool for an entire decade. The elevator door closed behind Victor with a soft, definitive sound, like a tombstone being sealed. He remained motionless as the cabin descended the 32 floors, watching the digital numbers decrease in a countdown that seemed to symbolize the deconstruction of his entire life. When the doors opened on the ground floor, the outside world remained the same, indifferent to the personal collapse that had just occurred upstairs. The rain had started, a fine, persistent Seattle drizzle that turned the city shades of gray. Victor walked to the parking lot without an umbrella, letting the water stream down his face, mixing with tears he hadn't realized he was shedding until he tasted salt on his lips. The black Mercedes he had parked so confidently 2 hours ago now seemed like an alien object, something that belonged to someone else, which, technically, was true. He got into the car anyway, desperately needing a private place to process the magnitude of what had just happened. The interior had that characteristic smell of expensive leather and air conditioning, an aroma he had always associated with success. Now it just smelled like lies. His hands trembled on the steering wheel as he tried to decide where to go. The house on Mercer Island? No, it wasn't his home anymore. It never had been. The phone vibrated in his suit jacket pocket. Probably Hartley, wanting to discuss next steps, or perhaps some colleague from the company, already alerted about the sudden change in leadership. He ignored it, letting the device vibrate until it stopped, then started again. On the third time, he finally looked at the screen. Jessica. The name pulsed there, a reminder of another layer of his life that was about to collapse. He had promised to meet her tonight, for dinner at a discreet Italian restaurant where they used to go, where the waiters knew their faces but never asked questions. Victor answered without thinking, driven by the need to hear a voice that didn't know of his humiliation. "Where are you?" Jessica's voice was soft, slightly concerned. "You missed the meeting with the West Coast developers. Brandon has been trying to find you for an hour." Victor closed his eyes, resting his head against the seat's headrest. Brandon Whitmore, his vice president of operations. A man Victor had personally hired, trained, mentored. Another professional relationship that was about to be revealed as based on illusions. "Jessica, I can't see you tonight." There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that precedes something unpleasant. "Victor, what's going on? You're being strange." Strange. He almost laughed at the inadequacy of the word. Strange was discovering that his entire life was an elaborate sham, that his wife had observed him for 10 years like a scientist observing a rat in a maze, patiently waiting to reveal that there was no cheese at the end, only the devastating truth of his own insignificance. "It's all over, Jessica. The company, the marriage, everything." The words came out automatically, disconnected from emotion. He was numb, as if his brain had activated some protective mechanism against emotional overload. "What do you mean it's over? Victor, you're scaring me." He should feel something for her, Victor vaguely thought. Some trace of affection or concern for how this news would affect her. But he felt nothing. Jessica was just another part of the fantasy, another element of the elaborate theater that had been his existence. "I have to go," he said, and hung up before she could respond. The phone immediately started ringing again, but he silenced it and threw it onto the passenger seat. Victor started driving aimlessly, letting instinct guide him through the familiar streets of Seattle. The rain had picked up, turning into a proper downpour, and the windshield wipers struggled against the deluge. He drove past Pike Place Market, where he had taken Claire on their first date 15 years ago. She had laughed when a fishmonger tossed a salmon over their heads, a genuine, joyful sound he hadn't heard in so long that he had forgotten what it was like. 15 years. They had met at the University of Washington, both graduate students, both ambitious and full of dreams. Or at least Victor thought they both were. Now he wondered what Claire had really thought of him in those early days. Did she already know about his family's fortune? Did she already have plans to create such an elaborate structure of financial control? The phone vibrated again, this time with a text message. Against his better judgment, Victor glanced at it quickly while stopped at a traffic light. It was from Brandon. "Emergency. Employees are being informed of leadership changes. I need to speak to you immediately." So it had already begun. Claire wasn't wasting time, methodically dismantling his world brick by brick. He wondered how she would explain the change. Strategic differences, Morrison had said. A polite lie to preserve what was left of his dignity. But how long would that version last? How long until someone started asking questions, digging deeper, discovering the pathetic truth? Victor found himself driving toward Ballard, a neighborhood he rarely visited, far from the social and professional circles he had cultivated. The streets were narrower here, lined with old houses and modest restaurants. He stopped in front of a bar called The Drifter, an establishment that looked like it had seen better days, with a faded facade and a single dirty window. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale beer and damp wood. A jukebox played something old and bluesy, and the few patrons scattered around the bar looked like people who had learned to value anonymity. Victor sat at the counter, and the bartender, a middle-aged man with a neatly trimmed gray beard, approached unhurriedly. "What'll it be?" "Whiskey," Victor replied. "Your best." The bartender studied him for a moment, probably noticing the expensive suit jacket and Italian shoes that didn't quite fit the surroundings. But he said nothing, simply poured a generous measure of Macallan into a rocks glass. Victor drank slowly, feeling the liquid burn his throat. He wasn't a frequent drinker, always careful with his image, always conscious of how he appeared to others. But now, what difference did it make? The image had been destroyed, revealed as an empty projection. "Rough day." The bartender had returned, wiping glasses with a white cloth. Victor let out a humorless laugh. "You could say that." "You got that look," the man continued, undeterred by Victor's dry tone. "The look of someone who's had the rug pulled out from under them." It was such a perfectly apt description that Victor found himself wanting to speak, wanting to confess to a stranger what had happened. Perhaps because this man didn't know him, had no expectations or prejudices about who Victor Brennan was supposed to be. "My wife," he began, surprised to hear his own voice crack slightly, "just showed me that everything I thought was mine, everything I thought I had built, was actually hers, always has been." The bartender nodded slowly, as if this story wasn't particularly uncommon in his establishment. "Money? Money, the company, the house, the cars, everything. For 10 years she let me believe I was successful, that I had built an empire. In reality, I was just a puppet, and she held all the strings." Why would she do that? It was the question that had been gnawing at Victor since he left that conference room. Revenge seemed too simple. Claire had waited 10 years, an entire decade, building this revelation like an artist working on a masterpiece. "Because I cheated on her," Victor finally admitted. "Repeatedly. I treated her as if she were invisible, as if she didn't matter. And she knew everything, all along, and she waited." The bartender poured another shot without Victor needing to ask. "Sounds like you got some things to process, pal." Victor drank the second whiskey faster than the first. The alcohol was starting to warm his blood, to dull the sharp edges of reality. He found himself thinking about specific moments over the years, recontextualizing them with his newfound knowledge. The time Claire suggested expanding into the Asian market, and he had dismissed the idea as naive, only to have the same idea 3 months later and present it as his own vision. Her expression that day, which he had interpreted as admiration for his insight, now revealed itself as something completely different. She had been watching him steal her own idea, allowing it to happen. Or the time he had almost closed a disastrous deal with a blockchain startup that later turned out to be a fraud. Claire had questioned the numbers, had expressed concerns, but he had silenced her, annoyed by her interference. The deal fell through at the last minute for technical reasons, but now Victor suspected Claire had intervened behind the scenes, saving him from a mistake that could have destroyed the company. His company. No, her company. He needed to start thinking that way. The phone vibrated again, a succession of messages that he ignored. The world outside was collapsing, professional relationships disintegrating. colleagues looking for answers he couldn't possibly give. In a few hours, he would probably be summoned for a final meeting, perhaps to sign more papers, to watch as his name was removed from the office door. "One more," he said to the bartender, pushing the empty glass across the bar. The man hesitated, studying Victor with eyes that had clearly seen many men in the same state. "Got anyone who can pick you up? You shouldn't be driving." Victor looked at the phone full of unread messages. Who would he call? Jessica, who was probably confused and possibly furious. Brandon, who would be looking for answers Victor didn't want to give. His parents in Florida, whom he had kept at arm's length for years, only visiting on obligatory holidays. There was no one. The realization came with sudden, sober clarity. He had spent 10 years building a life of superficial connections, based on mutual utility or physical attraction. He had no real friends, no confidants. There were only business associates and temporary lovers. "I'll get an Uber," he finally replied. The rain had stopped when Victor left the bar an hour later, leaving the streets of Ballard gleaming under the streetlights. The air was cold and clean, carrying the scent of wet asphalt and cedar. He waited on the sidewalk as the car approached, watching people pass by, each absorbed in their own lives, oblivious to the man in a $3,000 suit jacket who had just discovered he owned nothing. The Uber driver was a young man who thankfully didn't recognize Victor and didn't try to make conversation. Victor gave the address of the Mercer Island house out of habit, then corrected himself. He couldn't go there. Technically, he was already trespassing on Claire's property. "Actually, can you take me to the Fairmont Olympic?" He needed a place to stay, at least for tonight. As the car navigated the familiar streets of Seattle, Victor watched the city pass by the window. He had thought he knew every block, every street, having lived here for 15 years. But now everything looked different, strange, as if he were seeing Seattle through someone else's eyes. The Fairmont Olympic lobby was silent at that hour of the night, with only the discreet sound of an ornamental fountain and the muffled footsteps of a concierge crossing the marble floor. Victor approached the front desk, conscious of how he must look, with his rumpled suit jacket and eyes likely reddened from whiskey and emotional exhaustion. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with an impeccably professional smile, showed no judgment as she processed his request for a room. "How long will you be staying with us?" The simple question hit Victor with unexpected force. How long? He had no idea. 2 weeks, Morrison had said. 2 weeks to vacate the house, to dismantle a decade of existence, to figure out how to be Victor Brennan when stripped of everything that defined him. "Just tonight for now," he replied, handing over a credit card. At least that one was personal, not corporate. Probably one of the last transactions he could make before the reality of his new financial situation fully set in. The room on the 10th floor had a partial view of Elliott Bay, with the city lights reflecting on the dark water. Victor dropped his bag to the floor and walked to the window, pressing his forehead against the cold pane. Down below, life continued its relentless march. Cars passed, people emerged from restaurants. A couple laughed as they ran under the renewed drizzle. No one knew that there, 10 floors above, a man was confronting the total collapse of his identity. His phone had gone silent an hour ago, the battery finally dying after countless ignored messages and calls. Victor felt a perverse relief seeing the black screen, as if the device's shutdown could temporarily pause the crumbling of his life as well. He plugged the charger into the wall and watched as the device slowly came back to life, immediately flooded with notifications. 23 missed calls, 47 text messages, 12 emails marked urgent. Victor started reading, beginning with Brandon's messages. The first ones were confused, asking for explanations about the missed meeting and rumors of leadership changes. Then they grew more desperate, mentioning that Claire had called an emergency meeting with the entire executive team, that there were lawyers in the office, that people were panicking. Brandon's last message had been sent just 15 minutes ago. "Victor, what the hell is going on? Claire just announced you're leaving the company. She's taken over as CEO. There are rumors you two are getting divorced. Please call me. Everyone's lost here. So it was already public. The transition had been swift and efficient, exactly as Claire would plan. No hesitation, no unnecessary drama. Just a clean transfer of power, executed with the precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. Victor scrolled through the other messages. Several were from colleagues expressing confusion and concern. Some were from social acquaintances, clearly fishing for gossip. One was from his mother in Florida, having obviously heard something through the social network that connected the wives of Seattle tech executives. "Victor, darling, I just spoke with Diane Patterson. She said there are rumors about you and Claire. Please call me. I'm worried." He couldn't bring himself to reply. What would he say? How would he explain to a parent that the son they were so proud of, the successful entrepreneur whose achievements they celebrated at family dinners, was actually a fraud? A man who had been propped up by the wife he cheated on, who had never really built anything on his own. Jessica's message was longer, a wall of text that alternated between concern and irritation. "Victor, you can't just hang up on me and disappear. What did you mean it's all over? People at the office are saying crazy things. They're saying Claire always owned the company, that you're being removed. That doesn't make sense. Please call me. I'm getting worried, or angry. I don't know which." Victor tossed the phone onto the bed and walked to the minibar, extracting a bottle of vodka without even looking at the price. He poured a generous shot into a plastic cup, added ice from a machine that hummed discreetly in the corner, and drank as he sat in the armchair next to the window. Memories continued to assault him, each one now colored with the new understanding of their true nature. The launch party for Brennan Technologies 7 years ago, when they finally reached their first million in revenue. Victor had given an emotional speech thanking the investors, the team, the market that believed in his vision. Claire was there, wearing an elegant emerald green dress, politely applauding at the back of the room. He had thought she looked proud. Now he realized she was probably holding back a laugh at the irony. Or the time they had been featured in Seattle Business Magazine, a cover story on young entrepreneurs transforming the tech industry. The journalist had interviewed Victor extensively about his journey, his challenges, his business philosophy. Claire appeared in only one photo, identified simply as Claire Brennan, wife. She had read the article in silence over breakfast that morning, making no comments, though Victor had noticed something odd in her expression. Now he understood. She was reading an article glorifying a man who didn't exist, celebrating achievements that were, in fact, hers. The phone rang, interrupting his reflections. It was an unknown number. Victor hesitated, then answered, driven by a morbid curiosity about who else might be trying to reach him. "Mr. Brennan." The voice was female, professional, and unfamiliar. "My name is Rachel Torres. I'm a journalist with the Seattle Times. I'd like to ask a few questions about your departure from Brennan Technologies." Victor felt his stomach drop. So the media was already involved. Of course it would be. The sudden departure of a CEO from a growing tech company would be news, especially in Seattle, where the tech industry was closely followed. "No comment," he said automatically. "Mr. Brennan, there are rumors that the true ownership structure of the company is different from what has always been publicly presented. Can you comment on that?" So it was already leaking. Despite Morrison's promises to keep everything quiet, someone was talking. Perhaps an employee speculating. Perhaps someone who had access to documents and decided to share privileged information. "I said no comment," Victor repeated more firmly this time, and hung up. He needed a lawyer. Not Hartley, who was clearly out of his depth in this situation, but someone specializing in public relations and crisis management. Someone who could control the narrative before it turned into a full-blown scandal. But then, why bother? The truth would eventually come out, no matter how much he tried to control it. And there was something almost liberating in letting everything collapse publicly. Perhaps it was the penance he deserved, the public punishment that matched the magnitude of his arrogance and betrayal. Victor poured more vodka, feeling the alcohol create a pleasant haze in his mind, dulling the sharp edges of reality. He thought of Claire at that moment, probably at home in the Mercer Island mansion that had always been hers. Was she feeling vindicated? Satisfied? Or was there something more complex going on in her mind? Her words came back to him, that vulnerable moment in the conference room when her defenses had briefly dropped. Because I loved you, and I wanted you to love me back. Past tense. She loved him. Not anymore. And how could she? He had systematically killed any love she might have felt through years of neglect and betrayal. Every affair, every lie, every moment he treated her as if she were invisible had been another nail in the coffin of their marriage. The strange thing was that Victor wasn't sure if he had ever truly loved her. He had been attracted to her in college, certainly. Claire was intelligent, beautiful, confident in a way that wasn't common among graduate students. But love, real, deep love, the kind that sustains a marriage through decades? He had never stopped to seriously consider the question. Now, sitting alone in an expensive hotel room, facing the ruin of everything he thought he was, Victor found himself considering for the first time what he had truly lost. Not the money or the status, though those were painful to give up. But Claire, the woman who knew him better than anyone, who had observed every flaw and weakness and still chose to stay, at least for a while. The woman who was intelligent enough to build an empire in secret, patient enough to wait a decade for revenge, but also generous enough to give him a dignified exit. He didn't deserve that generosity, not one bit. The phone rang again, another call from an unknown number. This time, Victor let it go to voicemail, then another call and another. The story was clearly gaining traction. Journalists sniffing blood in the water. Tomorrow there would probably be articles, speculations, maybe even photographs of him pulled from corporate event archives. Victor turned his phone completely off and tossed it to the other side of the bed. He finished the vodka and considered getting another bottle, but decided against it. Drinking himself into oblivion was tempting, but it wouldn't solve anything. Tomorrow would arrive regardless, bringing with it all the consequences he had spent a decade building towards. He dragged himself to the bathroom and looked at his reflection in the immaculately clean mirror. The man looking back seemed years older than he had that morning. With bloodshot eyes and an expression of defeat Victor had never seen on his own face before. This was Victor Brennan stripped of illusions, without the veneer of success and confidence he had worn as armor. It was, he realized with sudden, sober clarity, the first time in years he was truly seeing himself, honestly. Morning arrived with a peculiar cruelty, seeping through the heavy hotel curtains and tearing Victor from a restless sleep filled with fragmented nightmares. He woke up disoriented, needing several seconds to remember where he was and why his body ached, as if he'd been beaten. Then the memory rushed back in a nauseating wave, and with it came the renewed understanding that yesterday hadn't been a nightmare. It was real. Everything was devastatingly real. The phone he had turned off the night before remained silent on the nightstand, a small island of peace amidst the chaos that surely awaited him on the other side. Victor considered leaving it that way, permanently disconnected from a world he was no longer sure how to navigate. But cowardice had its limits, even for him. With fingers that still trembled slightly, he powered the device back on and watched as the screen came to life, immediately flooded with more notifications than he could count. Among them, an email that sent a chill down his spine. It was from Morrison, sent at 6 in the morning, with a subject line that read simply, "Urgent, media situation." Victor opened the message with sweaty hands. "Mr. Brennan, the story has leaked to the press more extensively than we anticipated. The Seattle Times will publish an article this morning detailing aspects of Brennan Technologies' ownership structure. My client has requested that I inform you and offer crisis management assistance, should you desire it. Despite the circumstances, she has no interest in seeing you publicly destroyed beyond what is necessary. Please contact me as soon as possible to discuss how best to proceed." Victor rushed to the laptop he'd brought out of habit, opening it with an urgency that bordered on desperation. The Seattle Times homepage loaded quickly, and there, not as the main headline but prominent enough to be impossible to ignore, was the article. Sudden leadership change at Brennan Technologies raises questions about corporate structure. His hands trembled as he clicked the link. The journalist, Rachel Torres, had done her job well. The article was carefully written to avoid direct defamation, but the implications were clear enough for anyone who could read between the lines. It mentioned that Claire Brennan had taken over as CEO after Victor's unexpected departure. It referenced sources familiar with the corporate structure, suggesting that the company's ownership was more complex than public documents indicated. There was even an anonymous quote from an employee saying that it always felt like Ms. Brennan had more strategic influence than her role suggested. The phone began to ring before Victor finished reading the article. It was a Seattle number he didn't recognize, probably another journalist. He let it go to voicemail, but immediately another call came in. Then another. The barrage had begun. Victor called Morrison directly, not caring that it wasn't even 8 in the morning yet. The lawyer answered on the second ring, his voice professional, but with a hint of concern that hadn't been there yesterday. "Mr. Brennan, thank you for returning my call. I presume you've seen the article? How did this happen? You said it would be discreet." Morrison sighed faintly, an almost imperceptible sound through the line. Someone at the company spoke, likely an employee trying to understand the sudden changes. The story is too tempting for journalists to ignore. A CEO removed from his own company, rumors about the wife being the true force behind the empire. It's the kind of narrative the media loves. Victor closed his eyes, pressing his fingers against his temples where a headache throbbed with cruel persistence. What happens now? My client is willing to issue a joint statement, framing the situation as a mutual restructuring decision during the divorce process. It would minimize the damage to your reputation, though not eliminate it completely. The alternative is to let the story develop naturally, and I can assure you, it will only get worse as more details emerge. It was a choice between controlled humiliation and complete humiliation. Victor let out a bitter laugh. Why is Claire doing this? Why help me now? There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Morrison spoke again, there was something different in his voice, something almost human beyond the calculated professionalism. Between you and me, Mr. Brennan, I think my client is discovering that revenge isn't as satisfying as she imagined it would be. She spent 10 years planning this, and now that it's done, I think she's questioning if it was worth it. The revelation hit Victor with unexpected force. Claire regretted it? No, it probably wasn't regret. But maybe it was something close. Perhaps she was realizing that destroying someone, even someone who deserved it, left scars on one's own soul. "I'll accept the joint statement," Victor said, his voice weary. "What do I need to do?" Morrison guided him through the details. There would be a brief press conference late that afternoon, with Victor and Claire presenting a united front, speaking about different directions and personal priorities. It was theater, obviously, but necessary theater to preserve what remained of both their dignities. After hanging up, Victor forced himself into the shower, letting the hot water pound against his tense shoulders. Steam filled the bathroom, creating a mist that obscured the mirror, and he was grateful not to have to face his reflection again. The version of himself he'd seen last night still haunted him. He dressed in the same clothes from the day before, wrinkled but still expensive enough to maintain appearances. He would need to go to the Mercer Island house at some point to retrieve more belongings, but the idea of entering that space, knowing now that it had never truly been his, seemed unbearable. The phone rang again, and this time it was Brandon. Victor hesitated, then answered, bracing himself for what was to come. "Victor, finally." Brandon's voice sounded exhausted, as if he hadn't slept. "Where the hell are you?" "We need to talk." I'm at the Fairmont. Brandon, I'm so sorry about all this. Sorry? Victor, there are journalists calling the office. Employees are panicking. Claire is conducting meetings with individual departments, restructuring everything. You need to get back here and explain what's happening. Victor closed his eyes, the weight of the situation pressing against his chest. I can't go back, Brandon. The company isn't mine anymore. It never was, actually. What do you mean, never was? You founded Brennan Technologies. I was there at the beginning, remember? In that tiny office on Capitol Hill, working 16-hour days. The money was hers, Victor said simply. All of it. Through offshore structures, trusts, shell corporations. Claire was always the true owner. I just didn't know. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute, so complete that Victor checked if the call had dropped. Brandon? I don't know what to say. Brandon's voice had lost all its previous urgency, replaced by genuine shock. How is that possible? How did you not know? Because I was too arrogant to ask questions. Because when the money appeared, I assumed it was because of me, because of my vision and hard work. It never occurred to me that someone could be manipulating me all this time. Brandon took a deep breath, audible through the connection. People are asking about the infidelities too. The rumors always existed, but now with the divorce being public, everyone is talking. About Jessica, about other women. Victor, this is getting ugly. Of course they were. The vultures always circled when they sensed weakness. Victor could imagine the conversations happening in the halls of Brennan Technologies, employees speculating, judging, unearthing every rumor they had heard over the years. There's going to be a statement today, Victor explained. Claire and I are going to present it as an amicable separation, changes in life priorities. It won't be the whole truth, but it's better than the alternative. Do you still love her? The question came suddenly, catching Victor off guard. He was silent for a long moment, considering honestly for the first time. Love felt like too simple a word for the complex tangle of emotions he now felt for Claire. There was resentment for the manipulation, of course, but there was also admiration for the intelligence she had shown, for the patience she had exercised. And beneath it all, there was something that could be remorse, not for what he was losing now, but for what he had never adequately valued when he had it. I don't know, he finally admitted. I guess I never really did. Brandon sighed heavily. I'll try to hold things down here as best I can. But Victor, you need to understand that this changes everything. The way people see you, the way they see the company, it's going to be hard to rebuild after this. After hanging up, Victor sat on the edge of the bed, watching the morning light spread over the city through the window. Seattle was waking up, people going to work, living their lives, oblivious to the personal drama of a man who had believed himself to be important. The reality was that he had never been as significant as he imagined. The world would keep turning without Victor Brennan, CEO. It would probably barely notice his absence. There was a strange freedom in this realization. For 10 years, he had carried the weight of self-perceived importance, the pressure to maintain an image of success and control. Now, stripped of all that, there was just a man trying to figure out who he really was beneath the layers of illusion. The phone vibrated with a message from Morrison providing details for the press conference. It would be at 4 p.m, in the same building where the divorce had been finalized. The symmetry was not lost on Victor. It would begin and end in the same place. A full cycle of revelation and consequence. He had 8 hours until he needed to face Claire again. 8 hours to prepare the face he would show the world. 8 hours to decide who Victor Brennan would be after everything completely fell apart. Victor spent the next few hours wandering Seattle like a ghost, unable to stay still in the hotel room where the walls seemed to close in on him. He walked the familiar streets that now seemed to belong to another life, observing the city through eyes that saw everything differently. Every corner held memories that needed to be recontextualized. Every building bore witness to a version of himself that no longer existed. He found himself at Kerry Park, the tourist viewpoint that offered the iconic Seattle skyline with the Space Needle etched against the sky. It was a place where he had taken investors to impress them, where he had taken corporate photos that projected success and control. Now he stood there alone, just another anonymous observer contemplating the city stretching out below in every direction. The October wind was biting, carrying the smell of dead leaves and impending rain, and Victor pulled his coat tighter against his body. An elderly woman sitting on one of the benches fed pigeons breadcrumbs, murmuring to the birds as if they were old friends. She looked at Victor with keen eyes that seemed to see beyond the facade of the expensive suit and carefully maintained posture. "You have that look," she said without preamble, her voice hoarse from time and cigarettes. "The look of someone who has lost their way." Victor almost laughed at the accuracy of the observation coming from a complete stranger. "That's one way to put it," he replied, surprised to find himself engaging in conversation. "I had that look once," she continued, tossing more crumbs to the pigeons clustered at her feet. "When my husband died and I found out he'd left our house and all our savings to the woman he'd been having an affair with for 15 years. I thought my world had ended." Victor sat beside her on the bench, the woman's story resonating uncomfortably with his own situation, albeit inverted. "What did you do?" She smiled, a smile that carried decades of hard-earned wisdom. "I cried for 3 months. Then I was furious for 6 more. And then, one day, I woke up and realized I had wasted 40 years of my life trying to be what he wanted me to be. The tragedy wasn't losing him. The tragedy was never being myself while I had him." She turned to look at him directly. "Sometimes, losing everything is the only way to find out who we truly are without the masks." Her words stayed with Victor long after she had risen and left, leaving him alone with the pigeons and the cold wind. He thought of all the masks he had worn, all the fabricated versions of Victor Brennan he had presented to the world. The confident CEO, the visionary entrepreneur, the successful husband who secretly despised his wife while repeatedly cheating on her. None of those versions were real. All were performances built on foundations of sand. The phone vibrated, pulling him back to immediate reality. It was a message from Jessica, another in a series she had sent throughout the morning. "Victor, I need to know what's going on. I'm hearing things at the office that don't make sense. Claire called me for a private meeting this afternoon. I'm scared. Please, at least tell me if I should be worried about my job." Victor looked at the message for a long moment, considering how to respond. Jessica wasn't an innocent victim in all this. She knew he was married when they started their affair. But she also didn't deserve to be caught in the crossfire of his collapse. He typed a brief reply. "Go to the meeting. Claire won't fire you. She's too fair for that. But our relationship is over. I'm sorry I put you in this situation." The reply came almost immediately, 3 bubbles indicating she was typing, stopping, typing again. Finally, a single sentence appeared. "You never really loved me, did you?" The question was simple but loaded, demanding an honesty Victor had rarely practiced. He looked at his phone's keyboard, considering lying one more time, offering the kind of empty comfort he had always found so easy to dispense. But perhaps it was time to start practicing the truth, however painful it might be. "No. And I'm sorry for making you believe I did." He didn't wait for a response, putting his phone away and standing up from the bench. It was almost 2 in the afternoon, and he needed to get back to the hotel to prepare for the press conference, to prepare to see Claire again, to put on one last performance before the curtains closed definitively on the theater that had been his life. The journey back to the Fairmont took him through Pike Place Market, now bustling with tourists and locals doing weekend shopping. Victor walked past the fishmongers shouting their wares, the street performers playing out-of-tune guitars, the stalls filled with flowers so vibrant they almost hurt his eyes. It was real life happening around him, authentic and messy, and he realized he had spent years shielded from all of it, protected in his bubble of luxury and illusion. At a flower stall, A little girl held a bouquet of daisies, gazing at them with childlike wonder, while her mother haggled over the price with the vendor. Something about the scene made Victor stop. Claire had loved daisies when they first met, saying they were honest in their simplicity, without pretensions of being something they weren't. When was the last time he had bought flowers for her? He couldn't remember. Probably years. "How much for the bouquet of daisies?" he heard himself ask. The vendor quoted a price, and Victor paid without haggling, accepting the flowers wrapped in brown paper. The girl's mother looked at him with curiosity, probably wondering why a man in an obviously expensive suit was buying cheap flowers at a market stall. Back at the hotel, Victor placed the daisies in a glass with water and watched them as he changed for the meeting. They seemed out of place in the sophisticated room, their simple white petals contrasting with the elegant decor. But there was something comforting in their presence, a reminder of something he had lost sight of long ago. At 3:30, Morrison called to confirm the final details. There would be approximately a dozen journalists present, representing the main local media outlets and some national tech publications. Victor and Claire would make a brief joint statement, answer a few carefully selected questions, and then it would be over. Simple, clean, controlled. "How is she?" Victor found himself asking before he could stop himself. Morrison hesitated. And in that pause, Victor detected something interesting. A crack in the lawyer's professional armor. "My client is processing the situation in her own way, Mr. Brennan. I can tell you that the last few days have been emotionally challenging for her as well, despite how things may seem." Of course they were. Victor had been so consumed by his own destruction that he hadn't properly considered what it had cost Claire. She had spent 10 years executing this plan, keeping secrets, watching the man she loved transform into someone she needed to punish. That couldn't have been easy, no matter how justified her anger. The car Morrison sent arrived promptly at 3:45. Victor got out with the bouquet of daisies, ignoring the driver's curious glance. During the drive to the law office, he mentally rehearsed what he would say, the carefully crafted words Morrison had helped him create. But it all sounded false, yet another performance in a life built on performances. The building's lobby was different this time, with cameras being set up and journalists talking in small groups. Victor recognized a few faces from previous corporate event coverage, people who had written glowing articles about his business acumen and innovative leadership. Now they looked at him with appraising curiosity, obviously speculating about the juicy details behind the official story. Morrison met him in the elevator, his eyes briefly falling on the bouquet before returning to Victor's face. "She's in the conference room. I suggest a few private minutes before you face the press." Victor nodded, his throat suddenly dry. The hallway to the room seemed endlessly long, each step echoing against the marble floor. When Morrison opened the door, Victor saw Claire standing by the window, exactly where she had been yesterday. But there was something different about her posture today, something less triumphant and more weary. She turned as he entered, and Victor saw what Morrison had hinted at. Claire looked exhausted, with shadows under her eyes that makeup couldn't completely hide. Her eyes met Victor's, then fell to the daisies in his hands, and something crossed her face, too quickly for him to fully decipher. "Victor," she said simply, her voice neutral but not hostile. "Claire." He held out the flowers, the gesture seeming simultaneously ridiculous and necessary. "I remembered you used to like them." She took the bouquet slowly, her fingers brushing his for a fraction of a second. She studied the flowers with an expression Victor couldn't read, then placed them carefully on the conference table. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That was thoughtful." Morrison discreetly left the room, giving them privacy. The silence that followed was dense with everything unsaid, with years of accumulated wounds and resentments. "Claire, I know apologies are inadequate," Victor began, the words coming out without the careful rehearsal he had planned. "I know nothing I say can undo what I did, the way I treated you. But I need you to know that I finally understand. Not just what you did, but why you did it. She watched him with those eyes that seemed to see through all his defenses. And what exactly do you understand, Victor? That I spent 10 years being the kind of man who deserved exactly what you gave me. That you tried to love me, and I made it impossible. That your revenge wasn't cruelty, it was justice. He took a deep breath. And that you are still being more generous with me than I deserve. Something shifted in Claire's face, an almost imperceptible softening around her eyes. She walked to the window again, looking out at the city that had witnessed their marriage, his betrayals, and now their dissolution. When I planned this, she said softly, I thought I would feel vindicated. Powerful, like I had finally taken control back. But in truth, I just feel tired and sad about the waste of everything. Victor moved closer, maintaining a respectful distance but wanting to be nearer, needing her to know he was truly listening. What happens now, after today? Claire turned to face him, and for the first time since everything began, Victor saw something beyond anger or satisfaction in her eyes. There was sadness there, yes, but also something that could be understood as peace, or at least the promise of it. We move forward, she replied, separately. You rebuild your life, discover who you are without the illusions, and I finally stop carrying the weight of a marriage that died years ago, but which I kept sustaining out of pride or fear or a combination of the two. Are you staying in Seattle? For now. The company needs stability, and ironically, despite everything, I still believe in what we built. She paused. What you built too, Victor. Your ideas, your product vision. That was always real. It was just the money that was mine. The generosity of the acknowledgement struck Victor deeply. Even now, even after everything, Claire was trying to preserve something of him, some fragment of dignity amidst the destruction. I don't deserve your kindness, he said, his voice breaking slightly. No, she agreed without hesitation. But maybe I need to give that for myself, not for you. To finally be able to let go. A soft knock on the door interrupted the moment. Morrison entered, his professional expression firmly in place. It's time. The journalists are ready. Claire picked up the daisies from the table, holding them against her chest for a moment before offering them back to Victor. Keep these, she said, as a reminder of who you were before you got lost. Maybe it will help you find your way back. Victor accepted the flowers, unable to trust his voice to reply. Side by side, they walked to the room where the cameras awaited them, prepared to give one last performance together. But this time, Victor thought, at least part of it would be real. The sadness would be genuine, the regret authentic, and perhaps, just perhaps, there would be room for something like forgiveness in the ruins of what they had been. The conference room, a makeshift press studio, was suffocating, despite the air conditioning working at full blast. Victor could feel sweat gathering on the back of his neck as the camera lights illuminated every detail of his face, exposing every line of weariness and defeat he could no longer hide. Claire sat beside him, so close he could smell the subtle perfume she wore, the same one from 10 years ago, a scent that now carried the weight of everything they had lost. Morrison stood behind them, a silent but comforting presence, as the journalists settled into their chairs, pens ready, cameras adjusted. Victor recognized Rachel Torres in the front row, her intelligent eyes studying him with the intensity of someone who already knew there was more to the story than would be revealed today. Claire was the one who spoke first, her voice calm and controlled, each word measured with the precision of someone who had rehearsed extensively. She explained that the marriage had faced difficulties in recent years, that they had both grown in different directions. She spoke of the mutual decision to separate, of the desire to maintain dignity and respect during the process. It was all true technically, but so carefully edited that the reality lay hidden between the lines. When it was Victor's turn to speak, he found that the rehearsed words died in his throat. He looked at the expectant faces before him, at the cameras that would broadcast his words to thousands of people, and something inside him broke. Not dramatically, not explosively, but like a dam slowly giving way to constant pressure. "I'd like to add something," he said, and felt Claire tense beside him. Morrison stepped forward, likely prepared to intervene if Victor went off script. But Victor continued, words flowing from a place deeper than calculation or strategy. "During our marriage, I failed as a husband in ways that cannot be adequately expressed in a public statement. Claire Brennan is one of the most intelligent, strong, and generous women I've ever known, and I spent years failing to acknowledge that, failing to value that." The journalists leaned forward, sensing blood in the water. This was not part of the carefully constructed script. Claire turned her head slightly towards him, surprise evident in her eyes. "The truth about Brennan Technologies' ownership structure is complex," Victor continued. "But what isn't complex is this. Claire was always the driving force behind the company. Her ideas, her strategic vision, her financial backing through her family. I had the privilege of working alongside her building something significant, but I let my ego blind me to my own limitations and to her essential contributions." Morrison had stopped trying to intervene, recognizing perhaps that this public confession was something Victor needed to do, regardless of the public relations consequences. "So yes, we are divorcing. And yes, I am stepping down from the company's leadership. But not because there is insurmountable conflict or bitterness. I am leaving because I finally recognize that Claire should have been in charge from the beginning, and because I need to discover who I am when I'm not hiding behind illusions of my own importance." The silence that followed was so complete that Victor could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights on the ceiling. Then, like a breaking wave, questions began to come from all directions. Rachel Torres was the first to get their attention. "Mr. Brennan, are you saying you were never truly the owner of the company?" Victor took a deep breath, glancing briefly at Claire before replying. She wasn't looking at him, but at her own hands in her lap, her fingers clasped so tightly that her knuckles were white. "I'm saying that the reality of ownership was more nuanced than I understood at the time, and that I'm only just beginning to grasp how profoundly I misinterpreted my own story." Another journalist raised his hand, an older man Victor recognized from a national tech publication. "Ms. Brennan, did you always know about your husband's extramarital affairs?" The question cut through the air like a knife, and Victor felt shame burn his face. He started to intervene, to deflect, but Claire placed a gentle hand on his arm, stopping him. "I knew," she said simply, her voice breaking only slightly. "And I chose to deal with it privately, as it should be. But I will say this. Betrayal isn't just about physical infidelity. It's about not honoring the commitments you made, about not valuing the person you chose to share your life with. In that aspect, we both failed each other in different ways." The generosity of the statement, including herself in the failure when they both knew the weight lay overwhelmingly on Victor, made something inside him break completely. Tears, which he had held back since everything began, finally overflowed, streaming down his face in front of all those cameras, in front of the judging world. "I'm sorry," he managed to say, furiously wiping away the tears. "I'm sorry for everything." Morrison then intervened, declaring that the press conference was over, that there would be no more questions. The journalists protested, wanting more, always wanting more, but Morrison was firm, guiding Victor and Claire out of the room as the cameras continued to film, capturing every moment of his humiliation and pain. In the empty hallway outside, away from the hungry eyes of the media, Victor leaned against the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Claire remained a few steps away, watching him, with an expression that was impossible to fully decipher. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally. "You didn't have to expose yourself like that." "I needed to," Victor replied, his voice hoarse. "I needed to stop hiding, to stop building more layers of lies on top of the old ones. I needed at least one thing I said to be completely true. Claire took a step towards him, then stopped, as if an invisible barrier prevented further closeness. What are you going to do now? Victor let out a humorless laugh, wiping the last traces of tears from his face. Honestly, I have no idea. Find an apartment I can actually afford. Maybe try to start something new, something smaller and more honest. Figure out who Victor Brennan is when he's not pretending to be something he's not. You were always smart, Claire said softly. Your ideas were good. Your product vision was solid. It was just your self-perception that was distorted. You're still trying to save something from me even now. Not from you, for you. There's a difference. She glanced at her watch, a gesture Victor recognized as her defense mechanism when emotions became too intense. I need to go. There's a board meeting at 6 and I have to prepare. Victor nodded, knowing this was the moment. The true farewell after 15 years together. There would be no other dramatic encounter, no more shocking revelations. Just two people who had shared a life, now going their separate ways. Claire, he called as she began to turn away. Thank you. For giving me an out. For protecting what little dignity I had left when you could have utterly destroyed me. And I'm sorry for never being the man you deserved. She was silent for a long moment. And when she finally spoke, there were tears in her voice that she didn't try to hide. I loved that man once, Victor. The version of him I knew in college, before the success and the arrogance. I hope you find him again, wherever he's hiding. Then she was gone, her footsteps echoing down the hallway until they completely disappeared, leaving Victor alone with the weight of everything he had lost and the terrifying uncertainty of everything he still needed to build. 3 months later, Victor found himself in a small apartment in Fremont, a bohemian neighborhood in Seattle he had never frequented in his previous life. The space was modest, a one-bedroom apartment with a kitchen that barely fit 2 people. But it was his, paid for with the divorce settlement money, and there was something comforting in its simplicity. He had started working as a consultant for startups, using his real-world experience without the grand pretensions. The payments were modest compared to what he was used to, but they were honest, earned through genuine work and advice based on real experiences, both successes and spectacular failures. In the mornings, he ran along the Burke-Gilman Trail, watching the city wake up without the frantic urgency that used to drive his days. In the afternoons, he worked at a local coffee shop, where no one knew who he was or who he had been. In the evenings, he read the books he had always meant to read but never had time for, or simply sat on his small balcony watching people pass by, each living lives he was finally learning to value. The media had eventually lost interest in the story, moving on to the next scandal, the next fallen executive. There were occasional articles about Brennan Technologies' success under Claire's leadership, mentioning Victor only in passing as the former CEO who left to pursue other interests. Jessica had sent a message a few weeks after the press conference, a long message explaining that she had accepted a position at another company and wishing him luck. There was no bitterness in her words, just a kind of weary resolution. Victor replied, thanking her and wishing her well, and it was genuine. On a gray January afternoon, as Victor worked on his laptop at his favorite coffee shop, his phone vibrated with an unknown number. He considered ignoring it, but something made him answer. Victor Brennan. His voice was different now, softer, less filled with the artificial importance it used to carry. Victor, it's Claire. His heart leaped, surprised by how just the sound of her voice could still affect him. Claire. Hi. Is everything okay? It is. I read the article about your consulting work, in TechCrunch. It was well written, honest about your mistakes and what you learned from them. Victor had given an interview a few weeks earlier, speaking openly about his downfall and reconstruction. It was terrifying but also cathartic to publicly own his failures. Thanks. It was hard to be so open, but it felt necessary. There was a pause, filled only with the sound of her breathing on the phone. "You sound different," Claire said finally. "Lighter somehow." "I feel different. More honest, at least. Still working on figuring out who I really am. But it's a process. I'm proud of you, Victor, for what it's worth." The words hit him with unexpected force, and he felt tears prick his eyes for the first time in weeks. "That means a lot. More than you know." He hesitated, then continued. "How are you doing?" "Busy. The company's growing fast, which is exciting and exhausting. But good. I found a therapist who's helping me process everything, to let go of the anger." "That's good. You deserve peace." Another silence, more comfortable this time. "Maybe we could get coffee sometime," Claire suggested, her voice cautious. "Not now, it's still too soon, but eventually, as two people who shared a history and are trying to write better endings." "I'd like that," Victor replied, and realized it was true. After they hung up, Victor sat in the coffee shop for a long time, watching the rain begin to fall outside. There was something fitting about the Seattle rain now, no longer an inconvenience but a comforting presence, washing away the old and making space for the new. He didn't know what the future would bring, if he and Claire could ever have some kind of friendship, or if they were simply destined to be chapters in each other's story. But for the first time in years, Victor was okay with uncertainty. He was okay with not having all the answers, with not needing to project an image of absolute control and success. He was just a man rebuilding his life, one honest brick at a time, and perhaps, just perhaps, that was enough.